so many questions. Why is the world spinning? Why is the moon keeping its orbit? Can rockets fly backwards? The facts you didn't know you needed. The Useless Show.
Johannes and Lazarus Baptista Colloredo were 17th century conjoined twins joined at the chest, with Lazarus being the more fully developed of the two. They toured Europe as one of the continent's earliest prominent freak show attractions, drawing large crowds and significant attention. Supply-side economics argues that reducing taxes and deregulating industry stimulates investment, increases production, and ultimately grows the overall economy. Associated with Ronald Reagan's 1981 policies and nicknamed Reaganomics, it predicted tax cuts for corporations and wealthy individuals would generate growth that benefits everyone. Mason jar lids used for home canning are designed for single use only. The sealing compound on the flat lid can degrade after one heat cycle, making it unreliable for creating an airtight seal a second time. The metal screw band and the glass jar itself, however, are both fully reusable as long as they remain undamaged. Spandex, the stretchy synthetic fiber used in athletic wear, swimsuits, and compression garments, is an anagram of the word expands, all 7 letters rearranged. The material was developed by chemist Joseph Chivers at DuPont and introduced commercially in 1962. Before entering politics, Angela Merkel earned a doctorate in quantum chemistry from the Academy of Sciences in East Berlin in 1986. Her dissertation focused on the quantum chemistry of molecules. She worked as a research scientist until German reunification in 1990, after which she pivoted entirely into politics, a career shift that eventually led her to become Europe's most influential leader for nearly 2 decades. Soccer, formerly known as association football, is the most widely played sport on Earth, with over 250 million active players across more than 200 countries. No other sport comes close in terms of global participation. It requires minimal equipment, which helps explain why it has taken root in virtually every corner of the world. Chocolate chip enthusiasts apparently require 2 separate holidays. National Chocolate Chip Day falls on May 14th, while National Chocolate Chip Cookie Day is observed on August 4th. The distinction between celebrating the chip alone versus the chip inside a cookie is a level of specificity that says quite a lot about how seriously American food culture takes its desserts. Masking tape was invented in 1925 by 3M engineer Richard Drew, who developed it after observing auto body painters struggling to create clean paint lines between two-tone car sections, a popular style in the 1920s. The original tape used crepe paper backing with a lightly adhesive strip. Drew later invented Scotch transparent tape in 1930 using cellophane, giving 3M 2 of the most widely used adhesive products in commercial and household history. Bull riders use rosin, the same grip-enhancing resin used by gymnasts, baseball pitchers, and string musicians to improve their hold on the bull rope during a ride. The rosin is applied to the glove and rope to reduce slipping under the intense pressure and movement of a bucking bull. Maintaining grip for the required 8 seconds is the entire technical challenge of the sport. The $2 bill was removed from circulation by the U.S. Treasury in 1966 as part of a currency simplification effort, and no new $2 bills were printed for a full decade. The denomination was reintroduced in 1976 as part of the United States bicentennial celebration. Despite being legal tender, $2 bills remain rare enough in circulation that many people mistakenly believe they are no longer produced. Signed in 1215 by King John of England, the Magna Carta was the first document in history to establish that a monarch was not above the law. It arose from a rebellion by English barons who forced the king to agree that even royal authority had legal limits. Its 63 clauses directly influenced the United States Constitution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and virtually every modern legal system built on the principle of rule of law. Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province, sits entirely surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence with 0 land borders connecting it to anywhere else. Every other Canadian province shares at least 1 land boundary with a neighbor. PEI stands completely alone in that regard. In 2009, a white supremacist web series called The Andrew Show was produced with the explicit goal of spreading racist ideology to children through an animated format. It was hosted by Andrew Pendergraft, the granddaughter of Thomas Robb, National Director of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. The series drew significant condemnation before being largely removed from mainstream platforms. An extraordinary number of modern nations have at some point in history existed as 2 separate countries. Germany was divided from 1949 to 1990. Korea has been divided since 1945 and remains so. Vietnam was split from 1954 to 1975. China and Taiwan still contest the division that began in 1949. Ireland was partitioned in 1921. Even France was divided between the German-occupied North and Vichy-controlled South during World War II, demonstrating how fragile national borders have historically been. The stock market behaves remarkably like a person with severe mood swings, lurching from irrational confidence to sudden despair within a single trading session. Economist John Maynard Keynes described it as driven by animal spirits rather than logic. Despite decades of models and algorithms, no method has reliably predicted its short-term movements. The 13 golfers with the most PGA Tour wins in history are all American. Tiger Woods leads the list with 82 wins, followed by legends like Sam Snead and Jack Nicklaus. It's a remarkably clean sweep for one country across a sport played professionally around the entire world. The cheerleader effect describes the phenomenon where people appear more attractive when seen as part of a group than when viewed individually. Psychologist Drew Walker confirmed this in 2013, finding that the brain averages the facial features of people seen together, and that average tends to read as more attractive than any single face in isolation. Groups unintentionally flatter their members. The magnetic compass was developed in China during the Han Dynasty, between 206 BC and 220 AD, initially used for spiritual divination rather than navigation. It reached maritime use in China by the 11th century and arrived in Europe through Arab traders by the 12th century. Its adoption transformed ocean navigation from a coastline-hugging practice into true open sea, directly enabling the age of discovery and the European mapping of the globe. The official mascot for the 1976 Innsbruck Winter Olympics was a snowman named Schneemann, which is simply the German word for snowman. Innsbruck, Austria had previously hosted the 1964 Winter Games, making it one of the few cities to host twice. Schneemann was a fairly straightforward choice for a winter sporting event held in the Alps. Texas has existed under 6 different national flags across its history, having been claimed or governed by Spain, France, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the United States, and the Confederate States of America. The theme park chain Six Flags takes its name directly from this history, with its original Arlington, Texas location in 1961, built around the concept of honoring all 6 governing nations of the land it stood on. The Ivy League comprises 8 private Northeastern universities: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Penn, Brown, Dartmouth, and Cornell. The term originated as an athletic conference designation in 1954, before becoming synonymous with academic prestige. Harvard, founded in 1636, is the oldest. Combined endowments across all 8 institutions exceed $200 billion. Acceptance rates have dropped below 5% at several schools, making admission statistically rarer than many lottery outcomes. A microbrewery is legally defined in the United States as producing fewer than 15,000 barrels of beer annually while remaining independently owned. The American craft beer movement grew from fewer than 100 microbreweries in 1980 to over 9,000 by 2022. The movement fundamentally disrupted the dominance of large industrial brewers like Anheuser-Busch and Miller Coors, shifting consumer preference toward regional, small-batch production across virtually every American city and most mid-sized towns. The Phillips curve, introduced by economist A.W. Phillips in 1958, describes an observed inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. When unemployment falls, wages rise, spending increases, and inflation follows. When unemployment rises, the reverse occurs. Stagflation in the 1970s, where both unemployment and inflation rose simultaneously, challenged the model significantly and forced economists to substantially rethink its reliability as a predictive tool. Apple's original rainbow-striped logo, designed by Rob Janoff in 1977, featured 6 colored horizontal bands intended to make computers feel approachable and human rather than coldly technical. The colors also confirmed that the Apple II displayed color graphics, a significant selling point at the time. Steve Jobs replaced the rainbow logo with a monochrome version in 1998 following his return to Apple, aligning the brand's visual identity with the minimalist aesthetic that would define the company's subsequent design era. Twin Peaks, David Lynch and Mark Frost's landmark television series, was set in the fictional town of Twin Peaks, Washington, and drew heavily on the visual atmosphere of the Pacific Northwest. Early in development, however, the show was conceived as being set in North Dakota. The shift to Washington significantly shaped the show's aesthetic identity. There are 25 recognized species of hamsters, ranging from the familiar golden or Syrian hamster, the one most commonly kept as a pet, to wild species found across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Most people encounter only one or two species in domestic settings, but the family is considerably more diverse than a pet store visit would suggest. Snowboarding debuted as an official Olympic sport at the 1998 Nagano Winter Games in Japan, featuring halfpipe and giant slalom events. Its inclusion reflected a decades-long evolution from a fringe counterculture activity, invented by Sherman Poppins' Snurfer in 1965, to a mainstream competitive discipline. American Ross won snowboarding's first Olympic gold medal in giant slalom, though he was briefly disqualified over a positive cannabis test before being reinstated by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. The Long Barrack at the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, served as the first hospital recorded in Spanish Texas during the 18th century, when the complex functioned as Mission San Antonio de Valero. The building treated soldiers and missionaries long before the famous 1836 battle took place on the same grounds. Today, the Long Barrack operates as a museum within the Alamo complex, housing artifacts and exhibits related to the site's history. The Wiccan pentagram, a five-pointed star inside a circle, was not permitted on U.S. military grave markers until 2007, despite the fact that dozens of other religious symbols had been approved for decades. The change came after a legal settlement following years of advocacy by Wiccan families of fallen soldiers, bringing the total number of approved religious emblems to 38 at the time. Bodybuilding as a competitive sport was officially banned in China in 1953, likely due to political attitudes toward Western-style athletics during that era. The ban remained in place for 30 years before being lifted in 1983, allowing the sport to gradually reestablish itself in the country. The Laffer curve, popularized by economist Arthur Laffer in the 1970s, illustrates that both 0% and 100% tax rates generate zero government revenue. Somewhere between them lies an optimal rate maximizing income without discouraging productivity. The concept became central to Ronald Reagan's 1981 tax cuts, sparking an ongoing debate about exactly where that optimal point actually sits. Ice hockey originally divided games into two halves, but the format was changed to 3 periods in 1910 by the National Hockey Association, the predecessor to the NHL. The switch allowed the ice to be resurfaced twice during a game rather than once, significantly improving playing conditions. VH1's Top 20 Video Countdown ran from 1994 to 2015, making it the longest-running music video countdown program of its kind. Over its 21-year run, it tracked the most-watched videos on the channel each week, essentially serving as a documented archive of mainstream music video culture across 2 full decades of pop, hip-hop, and R&B. The printing terms uppercase and lowercase derive directly from physical typecases used by printers from the 15th century onward. Typesetters worked with large wooden or metal cases holding individual letter blocks. Capital letters, used less frequently, were stored in the uppercase for easy visibility. Smaller letters, used constantly, occupied the lowercase within easier reach. The spatial arrangement of the printer's workstation became the permanent vocabulary of written language. In The Simpsons, every human character is drawn with only 4 fingers on each hand, a standard animation shortcut that reduces drawing complexity, except for God and Jesus, who are both depicted with 5 fingers. The distinction is subtle but consistent throughout the series, and animators have confirmed it was a deliberate creative choice to visually set those characters apart. The Cambodian national flag is the only country flag in the world to feature an actual building as its central image, a depiction of Angkor Wat, the 12th century Hindu temple complex built during the reign of King Suryavarman II. Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument on Earth by land area. The Pokémon franchise has expanded dramatically since its 1996 debut, with the number of officially recognized species growing from the original 151 to over 1,000 across successive game generations as of recent releases. Each new generation introduces regional variants, legendary creatures, and evolutionary forms. The franchise spans video games, trading cards, animation, and merchandise, generating over $150 billion in lifetime revenue and making Pikachu the single highest-grossing media franchise character in history. Heinz produces roughly 11 billion individual ketchup packets annually, enough to hand 2 packets to every person currently living on Earth. Despite the dominance of squeeze bottles and restaurant pumps, the single-serve packet remains a massive part of Heinz's business, supplied to fast food chains, airlines, cafeterias, and food service operations worldwide.
Since 1964, the James Randi Educational Foundation has offered $1 million to anyone demonstrating verifiable supernatural abilities under controlled scientific conditions. Applicants included psychics, faith healers, astrologers, and dowsers. After nearly 60 years and over 1,000 formal applications, not one person collected the prize. Randi closed the challenge in 2015, noting the results spoke clearly enough without requiring further testing. The extended middle finger as an obscene gesture has documented roots in ancient Rome, where it was known as the digitus imputicus, the shameless or indecent finger. Roman writers including Martial and Juvenal referenced the gesture explicitly, associating it with phallic symbolism and aggressive insult. English absorbs vocabulary from other languages more aggressively than almost any other tongue. Latin arrived through Roman occupation and later the Church. French flooded in after the Norman conquest of 1066. Global trade brought words from Hindi, Swahili, Arabic, and Nahuatl. Today, English contains over 170,000 words in active use, with roughly 60% of its vocabulary derived from Latin or French roots rather than its original Germanic base. World War I began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. But the war it triggered was not inevitable from that single event. What turned a political murder into a global conflict was a web of military alliances and mutual defense treaties so rigidly interconnected that each mobilization automatically triggered the next, pulling in nation after nation within weeks, in a chain of obligations that no single leader fully controlled. John Wilkes Booth was a professionally successful and widely celebrated stage actor before assassinating President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. From a prominent theatrical family, he performed Shakespeare across major American cities and was considered one of the most handsome and talented actors of his era. His fame gave him unquestioned access to Ford's Theater on that night, as staff recognized him as a frequent performer and visitor. The North Pole Marathon is an annual foot race held directly on the Arctic Ocean's frozen surface, at or near the geographic North Pole. The first edition was run in 2002, and participants race a standard 26.2-mile course in temperatures that can drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius. It is consistently listed among the most extreme endurance races on the planet. The Serbian dinar has been the national currency of Serbia since 2003, when the name was restored following the dissolution of Yugoslavia and subsequent political reorganization of the region. The dinar has historical roots stretching to medieval Serbian kingdoms, with coins bearing that name minted as early as the 13th century under King Stefan I crowned. The currency's long history makes it one of Europe's oldest continuously referenced monetary units, despite significant political interruptions. Keynesian economics, developed by British economist John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression of the 1930s, argues that governments should increase spending and stimulate demand during economic downturns rather than cutting budgets. When private spending collapses, public investment fills the gap. The theory directly shaped Roosevelt's New Deal and remains one of the most debated frameworks in modern economic policy. The last immigrant to be processed through Ellis Island's inspection facilities was a Norwegian merchant seaman named Arne Petersen in November 1954. At its peak, the station had processed over 1 million immigrants in a single year. By 1954, that era had quietly come to a close. Utah's nickname, the Beehive State, reflects the founding values of its early Mormon settlers, who adopted the beehive as a symbol of collective industry, cooperation, and productivity. The beehive appears on the state seal, the state flag, and highway route markers. Deseret, the original name proposed for the Utah Territory in 1849, was itself the Mormon scriptural word for honeybee. Fiat money has no intrinsic value. A paper bill is worth nothing physically, yet functions as currency because governments declare it legal tender and citizens accept it. The United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971 under President Nixon, fully transitioning to fiat currency. Since then, every major global currency has operated on collective trust rather than any physical commodity backing its value. Mensa International, the High IQ Society, takes its name not from an acronym but from the Latin word mensa, meaning table. The choice is deliberate. A round table has no head, symbolizing that all members, regardless of background or status, are considered equals within the organization. Pugs are among the sleepiest dog breeds, averaging around 14 hours of sleep per day. Their flat-faced, brachycephalic anatomy means they expend more energy on basic breathing than most breeds, which contributes to their need for extended rest. Despite their drowsy reputation, pugs tend to be alert and playful during their waking hours. Evolution was formally introduced by Charles Darwin in 1859, is now supported by fossil records, genetics, and direct observation, and yet a significant portion of the global population still rejects it. A 2021 Gallup survey found that about 40% of Americans believe humans were created in their present form. It remains one of the widest gaps between scientific consensus and public belief in modern history. Only about 2% of the global population is naturally blonde, making it one of the rarest naturally occurring hair colors in the world. The trait is most concentrated in Northern Europe, particularly in Scandinavia. Natural blonde hair also tends to darken with age, meaning many people born blonde no longer carry the color into adulthood. European welfare states have produced measurably higher quality of life, lower poverty rates, and better health outcomes compared to less comprehensive systems. However, economists including Alberto Alesina have documented associated reductions in labor participation, entrepreneurship rates, and working hours in Scandinavian and Western European nations relative to the United States. The trade-off between security and economic dynamism remains one of modern economics' most genuinely contested empirical debates. Fisherian Runaway describes a self-reinforcing cycle in sexual selection where a trait becomes increasingly exaggerated across generations simply because it is preferred. The peacock's tail is the classic example. Females preferred slightly longer tails, so longer-tailed males reproduced more, and the preference and the trait amplified each other over millennia until the tail became structurally impractical, driven entirely by inherited preference rather than survival advantage. Tom Brady was selected 199th overall in the 6th round of the 2000 NFL Draft by the New England Patriots, after 198 other players had already been chosen. 6 quarterbacks were picked before him. He spent his first season as a fourth-string player. Brady went on to win 7 Super Bowls and is widely considered the greatest quarterback in NFL history, making his draft position the most frequently cited example of scouting failure in professional sports.
Georgia on My Mind was written by Hoji Carmichael in 1930, but it was Ray Charles's 1960 recording that turned it into something truly iconic. The state of Georgia agreed, officially adopting it as the state song in 1979, nearly 2 decades after Charles made it famous. The very first product Motorola sold was not a radio or a phone. It was a battery eliminator, a device that allowed home radios to run on household electrical current instead of expensive disposable batteries. The company was founded in 1928 as the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, and the battery eliminator represented a practical, affordable solution to a common consumer problem of the era. Jackie Chan trained from childhood at the China Drama Academy in Hong Kong, a Peking opera school where he studied acrobatics, martial arts, singing, and performance for over a decade under extremely demanding conditions. Beyond his film career, he has released 20 studio albums across multiple languages, including Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese, and English, and is considered a genuine pop star throughout much of Asia. Earth's tectonic plates move at roughly the speed human fingernails grow, between 2 and 15 centimeters annually, yet this slow movement has reshaped every continent across geological time. The theory of plate tectonics, formally accepted only in the 1960s, unified previously puzzling observations about earthquake patterns, volcanic distribution, and the matching coastlines of Africa and South America into a single coherent explanation of Earth's geological behavior. The average person loses between 50 and 100 individual hairs per day as part of the normal hair growth cycle. Each strand goes through phases of growth, transition, and rest before shedding. Losing hair in this range is entirely healthy. It only becomes a clinical concern when shedding consistently exceeds that threshold or when regrowth fails to keep pace with the loss. The last public execution by guillotine took place in Versailles, France, on June 17, 1939, when Eugen Weidmann was executed before a gathered crowd. Public executions were banned in France shortly after. The last use of the guillotine overall occurred in 1977 in a private prison setting, making France one of the last Western nations to abolish the death penalty, which it did officially in 1981. Hayao Miyazaki drew on personal memory when creating My Neighbor Totoro in 1988. His mother suffered from spinal tuberculosis throughout his childhood, spending years hospitalized, mirroring the film's central narrative of two sisters whose mother is ill and hospitalized nearby. The rural Japanese countryside depicted in the film reflects the landscape of Miyazaki's own boyhood, making Totoro one of animation's most quietly autobiographical and emotionally grounded major studio productions. The most expensive piano ever sold is the crystal piano, a fully transparent instrument crafted from tempered glass and acrylic materials. It sold at auction for $3.22 million USD. The piano was notably played during the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics by Chinese pianist Lang Lang, which significantly elevated its profile. The stolen generation refers to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children forcibly removed from their families by Australian federal and state governments between approximately 1910 and 1970. Policies aimed at cultural assimilation separated an estimated 10 to 33% of Indigenous children from their communities. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal national apology, acknowledging the profound and intergenerational trauma these removals caused across entire communities. Food safety regulations exist because without them, contamination, mislabeling, and adulteration become commercially routine. The United States passed its first Food and Drug Act in 1906, after journalist Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle exposed horrifying conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants. Government standards since then have dramatically reduced foodborne illness, though outbreaks linked to regulatory gaps still kill thousands of Americans annually. Herd immunity occurs when enough of a population becomes immune to a disease, either through vaccination or prior infection. That transmission slows and eventually stops, protecting even those who cannot be vaccinated. The exact threshold varies by disease. Measles requires about 95% immunity to halt spread, while polio requires roughly 80%, making vaccination coverage a precise mathematical target, not a general guideline. Ashkenazi Jews, descended from Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, record the highest measured average IQ of any ethnic group, approximately 120, which is roughly 20 points above the global average. Researchers attribute this partly to centuries of cultural selection for scholarly ability, as literacy and intellectual achievement were deeply embedded in community life. Due to the accelerating expansion of the universe driven by dark energy, galaxies are moving away from each other faster than light can bridge the gap between them. In roughly 2 trillion years, every galaxy beyond our own will have receded beyond the observable horizon permanently. Astronomers born in that era would look out at a universe containing only the Milky Way, with no observable evidence that billions of other galaxies, or the Big Bang itself, ever existed. The avocado goes by several names, but one of its oldest informal titles is the alligator pear, a reference to its rough, bumpy, dark green skin and its pear-like shape. The name was commonly used in English-speaking markets through the early 20th century before. Avocado, derived from the Nahuatl word ahuacatl, gradually became the standard term across North America and Europe. Packing peanuts are color-coded by composition. White peanuts are made from at least 70% virgin polystyrene. Green ones contain at least 70% recycled polystyrene, and pink peanuts are manufactured with anti-static properties to protect sensitive electronics during shipping. The color system allows handlers and recipients to immediately identify the material type without any additional labeling. The world's first airline was not a conventional aircraft operation, but an airship service. DELAG, Deutsche Luftschiffahrtsaktiengesellschaft, launched in Germany in 1909 and operated passenger Zeppelin flights between German cities. Before World War I grounded operations, it had carried over 37,000 passengers without a single injury, making lighter-than-air travel the first commercially viable form of passenger aviation in history. With emus, it's the father who takes charge of incubating the eggs and raising the chicks. The female lays the eggs and then largely moves on, sometimes finding another mate. The male sits on the clutch for around 8 weeks, barely eating, and then continues caring for the chicks for up to 18 months. Exercising in new and varied ways has been shown to produce greater mood benefits than repeating the same routine. Novelty activates the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine in response to new physical challenges. Studies in behavioral neuroscience suggest that the combination of physical exertion and cognitive engagement required to learn a new movement pattern produces a measurably stronger sense of well-being than familiar exercise alone.
Cuisine is among the most durable expressions of cultural identity, encoding geography, history, religion, and trade routes into daily meals. Japanese cuisine reflects island geography and Buddhist dietary restrictions. Mexican food carries the layered history of Aztec, Spanish, and indigenous culinary traditions. The spread of ingredients through colonialism and trade permanently altered regional cuisines worldwide, making most dishes considered traditionally national actually the products of centuries of cross-cultural exchange. A sundog, formerly called parhelion, is an atmospheric optical phenomenon appearing as bright spots of light flanking the sun at the same elevation on the horizon. They form when sunlight refracts through hexagonal ice crystals suspended in high cirrus clouds, bending light at precisely 22 degrees. Sundogs appear most vividly in cold climates and have been documented and illustrated in meteorological and artistic records dating back to ancient times. Cyberpunk, steampunk, solarpunk, and decopunk all trace their roots back to retrofuturism, the imaginative practice of blending past aesthetics with futuristic technology. Each subgenre takes that core idea and filters it through a different era or political lens, but the underlying fascination with reimagining the future through the past remains constant across all of them. Judy Garland was paid $500 per week for her role as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz in 1939, a total that, while modest even by the standards of the time, was still significantly less than what her co-stars received. The actor who played the Cowardly Lion earned $2,500 per week. Garland was 16 years old during filming and had little leverage to negotiate otherwise. The use of the word spirits for distilled alcohol traces back to medieval Middle Eastern alchemists who observed that heating certain substances produced vapors, which they called the spirit of the material. When alcohol distillation spread into Europe, the term followed. The idea was that the vapor captured during distillation was the essential spirit being drawn out of the fermented liquid. The Bahamas has maintained a comprehensive ban on shark fishing, the sale of shark products, and shark fin trading since 2011, making it one of the first countries to establish a full shark sanctuary covering its entire exclusive economic zone. The policy was driven partly by the economic value of sharks to the Bahamian dive tourism industry, which generates far more revenue from live sharks than from their fins. Glenn Beck got his start in radio at just 13 years old, winning an on-air contest at a local station that led to his first broadcasting opportunity. He went on to build a long career in both radio and television, eventually hosting programs on CNN, Headline News, and Fox News. The early start gave him over 4 decades of on-air experience by the time he became a nationally recognized media figure. A sunflower's petal count follows the Fibonacci sequence. It will have either 34, 55, or 89 petals, depending on the size of the plant. This isn't a coincidence. The Fibonacci pattern appears repeatedly in nature because it represents the most efficient way for plants to pack seeds, petals, and leaves around a central point. The Church of England was created in 1534 not for theological reasons, but for a personal and political one. King Henry I wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a male heir. The Pope refused, partly to avoid offending Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Spain's ruler and the Vatican's most powerful political ally. Henry responded by declaring himself head of a separate English church and granting his own annulment. The feeling that time accelerates with age is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, rather than a literal change in time's pace. Psychologist William James noted in 1890 that each year becomes a smaller proportion of total life experience, making it feel shorter in retrospect. The brain compresses memories of routine periods and expands memories of novelty, creating an illusion that recent decades passed faster than childhood years did. The word flip-flops is a genuine example of onomatopoeia. The name mimics the slapping sound the sandals make against the sole of the foot with each step. It's one of the more straightforward examples of a product named after the noise it produces. The footwear itself dates back thousands of years, but the specific English name is a relatively modern invention. Greed systematically distorts perception. Bernie Madoff's investors ignored obvious warning signs because promised returns were extraordinary. Tulip mania buyers paid warship-sized fortunes for single flowers. dot-com investors funded companies with no revenue. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, where desired outcomes cause people to unconsciously dismiss contradicting evidence. The pattern repeats across every financial bubble in history because the underlying cognitive bias never changes between generations. Mardi Gras, French for Fat Tuesday, is the final day of the carnival season immediately preceding Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent in the Catholic liturgical calendar. Historically, it marked the last opportunity to consume rich foods before 40 days of fasting. New Orleans' celebration, established when French colonists arrived in Louisiana in 1699, grew into America's most famous Mardi Gras tradition, attracting over 1 million visitors annually to its parades and festivities. Occam's razor is a 14th century principle from philosopher William of Ockham, stating that among competing explanations, the one requiring the fewest assumptions is almost always correct. If a streetlight goes dark, the bulb burned out is the better explanation over a citywide power conspiracy. Science, medicine, and detective work all rely on this principle as a default starting point. The narwhal's closest living relative is the beluga whale. Both belong to the family, a small group of Arctic cetaceans with no dorsal fin. Despite the narwhal's dramatically distinct appearance, particularly the long spiral tusk, which is actually an elongated tooth, the two species share more biological similarities than the narwhal does with any other whale. In Belgium, approximately 54% of working adults are union members, making it one of the highest unionization rates among developed nations. For context, union membership in the United States sits below 11%. In Belgium, belonging to a union is genuinely the norm rather than the exception. The invisible hand is a concept introduced by economist Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. It describes how individuals pursuing personal profit in a free market, without intending to, collectively produce economic outcomes that benefit society broadly. Competition, pricing, and supply naturally self-regulate, as if guided by an unseen force requiring no central coordination. The Streisand effect explains that attempting to suppress information often backfires, drawing far more attention to it. In 2003, Barbara Streisand sued to remove an aerial photo of her Malibu home from a coastal survey. Before the lawsuit, the image had been viewed 6 times. Within weeks of the lawsuit becoming public, it had been viewed nearly 500,000 times.
Human motivation operates across multiple layers simultaneously. Psychologist Abraham Maslow's 1943 hierarchy proposed that basic needs like food and safety must be met before people pursue belonging, esteem, or purpose. Frederick Herzberg later distinguished between factors that prevent dissatisfaction and those that genuinely inspire performance. Understanding this distinction transformed how businesses design incentive systems, how teachers structure classrooms, and how leaders build organizations. Hyperbolic discounting describes the human tendency to choose a smaller reward available now over a significantly larger reward available later. In studies, most people prefer $10 today over $15 next week, even though that same logic applied consistently would be financially irrational. Behavioral economists link it to failures in retirement saving, diet adherence, and financial planning, where long-term benefit consistently loses to short-term comfort. In 2013, the NFL partnered with Victoria's Secret's Pink brand to expand merchandise targeting teenage girls and young women, a demographic the league had not previously prioritized in its licensing strategy. The deal reflected broader efforts to grow the NFL's female fan base, which at the time represented approximately 45% of total viewers. League-branded apparel became the centerpiece of the campaign, available through Pink's retail and online channels nationwide. Japan's transformation from a country leveled by World War II into the world's second-largest economy by the 1960s was substantially engineered by the United States. Fearing communist expansion in Asia, following Mao's victory in China and the Korean War, the U.S. invested heavily in Japanese industrial reconstruction, transferred technology, and opened American markets to Japanese exports, using economic development as a strategic buffer against Soviet and Chinese influence. The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986, released 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima atomic bomb and directly contaminated over 150,000 square kilometers across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Beyond its immediate casualties, it triggered a global reassessment of nuclear safety standards, contributed to the political destabilization of the Soviet Union, and resulted in the permanent evacuation of the city of Pripyat, which remains uninhabited to this day. In 1970, Cartier projected a holographic image of a jewel-covered hand onto the sidewalk outside their Fifth Avenue location in New York City as a promotional installation. The advertisement drew significant public attention at a time when holographic technology in commercial settings was extremely novel. The Haunted Mansion at Disney theme parks transports guests through its ghostly halls in vehicles officially called Doom Buggies. They move on a continuous track system called Omnimover, which allows the cars to rotate and direct riders' attention to specific scenes. The name Doom Buggy has been part of the ride's lore since it opened in 1969. France, Italy, and the United States are the top 3 wine-producing countries in the world, in that order. France and Italy have dominated global wine production for centuries, each contributing iconic varieties from regions like Bordeaux, Burgundy, Tuscany, and Piedmont. The United States, led primarily by California, has grown into a major producer over the past several decades. The first box of Crayola crayons was sold in 1903 for just 5 cents and contained 8 colors: black, brown, blue, red, purple, orange, yellow, and green. The brand was created by Beanie and Smith, a company that had previously made products like shoe polish and barn paint before pivoting towards something considerably more colorful. Before becoming one of the most significant political figures in LGBTQ history, Harvey Milk served in the United States Navy during the Korean War era, reaching the rank of lieutenant junior grade. He was later forced to resign during a period of military investigations into gay service members. His naval service predated his years as a San Francisco supervisor by roughly 2 decades. Traffic congestion predates automobiles by centuries. In 45 BC, Julius Caesar banned wheeled vehicles from Rome during daylight hours due to gridlock. In 1900, a traffic jam in New York City involving horses, carriages, bicycles, and electric trolleys paralyzed Lower Manhattan for 4 consecutive days. The chaos of pre-regulated roads was so severe that early automobiles were initially welcomed partly as a solution to horse-related congestion. Highclere Castle in Hampshire, England, serves as the filming location for Downton Abbey and has been the ancestral home of the Carnarvon family since 1679. The current Victorian Gothic structure was redesigned by Charles Barry, the same architect who designed the Houses of Parliament in the 1840s. The 5,000-acre estate is still privately owned and operated by the Earl and Countess of Carnarvon. Hello Kitty, introduced by Sanrio in 1974, generates approximately $5 billion in annual revenue through licensing agreements covering thousands of products across fashion, electronics, food, and entertainment. Designer Yuko Shimizu created her without a mouth, a deliberate choice allowing buyers to project their own emotions onto the character. Despite being among the world's most commercially successful fictional characters, Hello Kitty has never starred in a narrative story with a plot. Goats have horizontally elongated, rectangular pupils that give them an exceptionally wide field of vision, between 320 and 340 degrees. This near-panoramic sight allows them to monitor for predators across almost their entire surroundings without turning their head. The pupils also rotate to stay parallel to the ground, even as the goat lowers its head to graze, maintaining that wide visual field constantly. Ice needs to be at least 4 inches thick before it can safely support the weight of a single person on foot. At 2 inches, it may hold a person briefly, but remains dangerously unreliable. Ice thickness guidelines scale upward from there. A small car requires around 8 to 12 inches, and large trucks need significantly more before the surface is considered stable. Oliver and James Phelps, the twin brothers who portrayed Fred and George Weasley across all 8 Harry Potter films, are naturally brunette. Their signature red hair required consistent dyeing throughout the decade-long production schedule. The casting directors selected them from thousands of applicants specifically for their comedic chemistry and physical resemblance to each other, rather than any natural resemblance to the book's descriptions of the famously red-haired Weasley family. Wicca is a modern religious movement rooted in pre-Christian pagan traditions, but formally developed in mid-20th century England by Gerald Gardner, who introduced it publicly in the early 1950s. While it draws on older folk practices and ceremonial magic, Wicca as a structured belief system is relatively recent. It falls under the broader umbrella of paganism, but has its own distinct theology and ritual framework.
Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, reportedly quoted the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, upon witnessing the first atomic test in July 1945, saying he had become death, destroyer of worlds. His hope was that the bomb's destructive power would make large-scale war unthinkable. Since 1945, no two nuclear-armed states have gone to war directly with each other, suggesting that mutually assured destruction has functioned grimly, largely as intended. Oxytocin, often called the love hormone, is released during physical touch, eye contact, and moments of social bonding. It plays a documented role in increasing trust between individuals and strengthening group cohesion. Interestingly, research also shows oxytocin has a darker side, reinforcing in-group loyalty while simultaneously increasing suspicion of outsiders, making it simultaneously the hormone of connection and tribalism. Australia covers approximately 7.7 million square kilometers compared to the United States' 9.8 million, making it slightly smaller than the contiguous 48 states, but larger when Alaska is excluded from the comparison. It is simultaneously the world's largest island and its smallest continent, a geographical classification that depends entirely on whether one defines continent by landmass size or tectonic and cultural criteria applied inconsistently across different geography traditions. Social media algorithms are engineered to maximize engagement, and outrage consistently generates more engagement than agreement. Research from NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics found that each additional moral emotional word in a tweet increased retweet rates by approximately 20%. Platforms therefore systematically amplify divisive content not through deliberate political intent, but through optimization for the interaction metric that divisive content reliably produces more of. Lake Superior State University in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, has issued official unicorn hunting licenses since 1971, when the tradition was started as a lighthearted New Year's celebration. The licenses are genuine physical documents complete with an official seal and are available by request or through the university's website. The program has since issued hundreds of thousands of licenses to applicants worldwide. Monopolies and oligopolies form when one or a handful of companies dominate an entire market, eliminating meaningful competition. Without competitive pressure, prices rise, quality declines, and innovation slows. Standard Oil, broken up by the U.S. government in 1911, and today's debates around Amazon and Google illustrate how market concentration consistently produces outcomes that regulators, consumers, and smaller competitors find economically damaging and politically contentious. During the gold rushes of the 19th century, the people who consistently made the most money were not the prospectors panning for gold, but the merchants selling them shovels, pans, boots, and denim trousers. Levi Strauss built his fortune this way during the 1849 California gold rush. The prospectors took the risk. The suppliers took the profit, with far greater reliability and far less mud. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for approximately $7.2 million, working out to roughly 2 cents per acre. Secretary of State William Seward negotiated the deal and was widely mocked for it, with critics calling it Seward's folly. Alaska later proved to contain vast reserves of oil, gold, timber, and fisheries worth hundreds of billions of dollars, making it one of the most consequential real estate transactions in history. The albedo effect measures how much sunlight a surface reflects rather than absorbs. Fresh snow reflects about 80% of incoming solar radiation, while dark ocean water absorbs over 90%. As polar ice melts and exposes darker ocean beneath, more heat is absorbed, accelerating further warming. It is one of the key feedback loops studied in climate science today. GDP, or gross domestic product, measures the total monetary value of all goods and services a country produces within a given year. First developed by economist Simon Kuznets in 1934, it became the standard global benchmark for economic size and growth. Despite its widespread use, economists increasingly note it measures output, but says nothing about inequality, sustainability, or actual human well-being. Muzak is a company that became so synonymous with soft background music that its name effectively became a generic term for the genre itself. Founded in the 1930s, it originally piped recorded music into workplaces and elevators via telephone lines. The brand has since rebranded and expanded, but the word Muzak remains in casual use as shorthand for inoffensive ambient sound. Julie Andrews made her feature film debut as Mary Poppins in Disney's 1964 musical adaptation of P.L. Travers's novels. The role earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress, her first film performance winning Hollywood's highest honor. Andrews had been passed over for the film adaptation of My Fair Lady, despite originating the role on Broadway, and Mary Poppins was widely seen as a remarkable vindication. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed devastating conditions on Germany after World War I, including full war guilt, 132 billion gold marks in reparations, and severe military restrictions. Economists like John Maynard Keynes immediately warned the terms were punishing enough to destabilize Germany politically. They were correct. The resulting poverty, humiliation, and resentment created the conditions that brought Adolf Hitler to power and directly precipitated World War II within 2 decades. Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson met as students at the University of Texas at Austin in the late 1980s and co-wrote Anderson's debut feature Bottle Rocket, released in 1996. Wilson has appeared in every Anderson film in some capacity since, from starring roles in Rushmore and The Royal Tenenbaums to brief voice work. Their creative partnership, beginning in a college dormitory, produced one of the most consistent director-actor collaborations in contemporary American independent cinema. The jerboa is a small desert rodent found across the Sahara and similar arid climates that looks and moves almost exactly like a miniature kangaroo. It has elongated hind legs, a long balancing tail, and moves in rapid bipedal hops. The resemblance is entirely coincidental. The two animals are not closely related in any way. Liquid and dry measuring cups are designed differently in shape and markings, but a 1-cup liquid measuring cup and a 1-cup dry measuring cup hold the exact same volume. The difference is purely functional. Liquid cups allow space above the measurement line to avoid spilling, while dry cups are designed to be leveled off at the rim for accuracy with ingredients like flour or sugar. Route 66 stretched 2,448 miles from Chicago, Illinois to Santa Monica, California, established in 1926 as one of America's original federal highways. John Steinbeck immortalized it in The Grapes of Wrath as the Mother Road, the path Depression-era migrants traveled westward seeking work. Officially decommissioned in 1985 after being bypassed by interstate highways, it remains one of America's most recognized cultural symbols and a dedicated tourist route.
Chocolate as a beverage has roots stretching back to the ancient Maya civilization around 450 AD, who prepared a drink called zocolatl from ground cacao mixed with water, chili, and other spices. The drink was consumed in ritual and social contexts and was far more bitter and savory than modern hot chocolate. The tradition passed to the Aztecs and eventually reached Europe through Spanish colonizers in the 16th century. In Breaking Bad, Walter White's criminal alias Heisenberg is a direct reference to German physicist Werner Heisenberg, who developed the uncertainty principle in 1927. The principle states that you cannot simultaneously know both the exact position and momentum of a particle, a fitting name for a character who deliberately keeps his true identity impossible to pin down. The Dunning-Kruger effect explains that people with limited knowledge in a field tend to significantly overestimate their own competence. Psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger identified this in 1999, finding that the least skilled participants in tests consistently rank themselves well above average. Knowing a little, it turns out, is often just enough to feel like an expert. Urban wildlife adaptation is accelerating as cities expand into natural habitats. Red foxes have colonized London so thoroughly that an estimated 10,000 now live within the city. Peregrine falcons, once nearly extinct, now nest on skyscrapers across North America, hunting pigeons between office towers. Coyotes have established themselves in Chicago and Los Angeles. Cities, unintentionally, are becoming one of the most significant drivers of rapid behavioral evolution. Project Runway premiered on Bravo in 2004, challenging fashion designers to create garments under tight time constraints and limited budgets before judging panels including industry professionals. Running 14 seasons across Bravo and Lifetime, it generated 5 spin-offs and inspired international versions across dozens of countries. It established the competitive design format as a viable television genre and launched the mainstream careers of designers, including Christian Siriano and Chloe Dow. Candy apples were invented in 1908 by Newark candy maker William Kolb, who originally created them as a Christmas window display. The caramel apple came along decades later in the 1950s, reportedly invented by Kraft Foods employee Dan Walker, who was looking for a way to use excess caramel inventory. The two have coexisted as autumn fare staples ever since. Following the massive 2003 Northeast blackout that knocked out power across Ontario and several U.S. states, communities in Ontario organized an annual voluntary blackout day to mark the anniversary and encourage energy conservation awareness. Residents were asked to voluntarily reduce electricity use for a set period each year. The initiative ran until 2010. Roderick Jaynes, the editor listed in the credits of multiple Coen brothers films including Fargo and No Country for Old Men, is entirely fictional. The name is a pseudonym used by Joel and Ethan Coen, who edit their own films but prefer not to credit themselves in that role. Roderick Jaynes was even nominated for an Academy Award for editing No Country for Old Men in 2008. Brad Pitt was born on December 18, 1963, in Shawnee, Oklahoma. But his family relocated to Springfield, Missouri, when he was still young, and that's where he was raised. He attended the University of Missouri and was just 2 weeks away from graduating with a journalism degree when he decided to leave for Los Angeles to pursue acting, a decision that worked out reasonably well. Botanists have identified over 150 wild rose species distributed across the Northern Hemisphere, with the greatest diversity found across Asia. Through centuries of cultivation and hybridization, horticulturalists have developed an estimated 30,000 rose varieties worldwide. The oldest living cultivated rose, growing against the cathedral wall in Hildesheim, Germany, is documented at over 700 years old. Romans cultivated roses so extensively that they imported shipments from Egypt to supplement domestic production for festivals. Externalities occur when economic transactions impose costs or deliver benefits to parties not involved in the exchange. Factory pollution is the textbook example. The factory and its customers benefit while surrounding communities bear health and environmental costs neither paid for nor consented to. Economist Arthur Pigou proposed taxing negative externalities in 1920, a concept now called a Pigou tax and the theoretical foundation behind carbon pricing systems globally. Walter Cronkite was, at the peak of his career, considered the most trusted man in America, a title earned through decades of calm, fact-driven broadcast journalism. Objective news reached its zenith in the 1980s with Ted Koppel's Nightline, the most decorated news program of its era. Since then, news has steadily traded accuracy for entertainment and engagement for information. The IKEA effect explains that people assign disproportionately higher value to things they helped build themselves. A 2011 study by Michael Norton, Daniel Michon, and Dan Ariely found that participants valued their self-assembled IKEA boxes nearly as highly as identical expert-made ones. The effort invested creates a personal attachment that inflates perceived worth beyond any objective measure. The restaurant at the top of Seattle's Space Needle, called Sky City when it originally opened in 1962, sits in the disc-shaped top section and rotates continuously, completing a full 360-degree turn in approximately 47 minutes. Diners can sit still and watch the entire Seattle skyline, Puget Sound, and Mount Rainier pass by their window over the course of a meal without moving from their seat. Giant panda cubs are born in an extraordinarily underdeveloped state, pink, hairless, and about the size of a stick of butter. They do not open their eyes until roughly 6 to 8 weeks after birth and remain almost entirely dependent on their mothers for months. The gap between a panda's size at birth and its eventual adult weight of up to 300 pounds is one of the largest proportional differences of any mammal. When the Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago was completed in 2009, it ranked as the 7th tallest building in the world at 1,389 feet. It held that position briefly before being surpassed by newer constructions. The building remains one of the tallest skyscrapers in the Western Hemisphere and the second tallest in Chicago after the Willis Tower. In traditional Chinese culture, white is the color of death, mourning, and funerals, occupying the symbolic role that black holds in Western traditions. Mourners wear white at funerals, and white flowers, particularly white chrysanthemums, are associated with grief and loss. Gifting white flowers or presenting white items at celebrations is considered deeply inauspicious. This cultural association explains why international businesses operating in China frequently modify packaging and marketing materials that use white prominently.
The electric car predates the gasoline-powered car by roughly 5 decades. Scottish inventor Robert Anderson built the first crude electric carriage around 1832, while Carl Benz introduced the internal combustion automobile in 1885. The steam-powered car is older still, with Nicholas Joseph building a working steam vehicle in 1769, making it the first self-propelled road transport in recorded history. The hybrid car, often discussed as a modern breakthrough, was actually invented in 1909 by Henri Pieper, a Belgian engineer who patented a petrol-electric hybrid vehicle combining both power systems. Ferdinand Porsche also developed an early working hybrid around the same period. The technology sat largely dormant for most of the 20th century before Toyota revived it with the Prius in 1997. Penguins and kiwis share flightlessness despite evolving on opposite sides of the planet in completely different ecosystems. Penguins, adapted to Antarctic conditions, repurposed their wings as flippers for underwater hunting. New Zealand's kiwis, facing no ground predators for millions of years, lost flight through disuse. Both demonstrate that flightlessness evolves independently whenever the survival advantages of flight are outweighed by the advantages of staying grounded. Thomas Jefferson is credited with introducing French fries to the United States after encountering them in France during his time as ambassador. He reportedly served potatoes fried in the French manner at a White House dinner in 1801, marking one of the earliest documented appearances of the dish on American soil. The United Kingdom is the only country in the world that does not print its name on its postage stamps. Instead, British stamps feature a silhouette profile of the reigning monarch as their sole identifying marker. This exemption was granted by the Universal Postal Union in recognition of the fact that Britain issued the world's first adhesive postage stamp, the penny black, in 1840. Mike Medavoy, born in Shanghai to Russian Jewish parents, raised in China, Chile, and eventually the United States, is among the most prolific film producers in Hollywood history. He has been involved in over 300 films, including The Godfather, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Terminator, Apocalypse Now, and Silence of the Lambs. His career spans 5 decades in multiple studios, from United Artists to Tristar to Phoenix Pictures. Leonardo da Vinci first sketched the concept of corrective contact lenses in 1508, describing a lens system that could alter the eye's focusing ability when placed directly on the cornea. The idea remained theoretical for nearly 4 centuries before German glassblower F.A. Müller produced the first wearable glass contact lenses in 1887. Wearing them for extended periods was uncomfortable enough that widespread adoption didn't come until plastic lenses were developed in the 1940s. Kleenex facial tissues were introduced by Kimberly-Clark in 1924, originally marketed as a makeup remover rather than a nose tissue. However, the concept of disposable facial paper far predates that. Japan had been producing and using washi paper tissues since before the 17th century, making the idea considerably older than the brand that commercialized it in the West. Tonic water was developed in British colonial India as a medicinal delivery system for quinine, a compound derived from cinchona tree bark that effectively suppressed malaria. British soldiers required to consume bitter quinine daily began mixing it with water, sugar, and gin to make it palatable. The gin and tonic that resulted from this practical workaround became one of the most enduring cocktails in history, long outlasting its medical purpose. Tennessee Williams based the character of Big Daddy in his 1955 play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof on his own father, Cornelius Coffin Williams, a domineering, hard-drinking traveling salesman with whom the playwright had a deeply complicated relationship. The character's bluster, authority, and emotional distance reflect qualities Williams associated with his father throughout his life and writing. The Chelsea boot, the sleek, ankle-high, elastic-sided boot that became a staple of 1960s British fashion, actually dates back to 1851. It was designed and patented by J. Sparks Hall, the official shoemaker to Queen Victoria, who reportedly wore them regularly for horse riding. The elastic side panel was made possible by the relatively recent invention of vulcanized rubber at the time. The flush toilet was invented by Sir John Harrington in 1596, who installed a working model in the home of Queen Elizabeth I. The word John, as informal slang for a toilet, is widely attributed to his name, though the etymology is not conclusively documented. Harrington called his invention the Ajax, and while it worked mechanically, the technology wasn't widely adopted for another 200 years. Herman Cain, the businessman and political figure, managed to pursue 2 significant endeavors simultaneously early in his career. While working as a ballistics analyst for the U.S. Navy, he enrolled at Purdue University and completed a Master of Science in Computer Science. He balanced both commitments concurrently before moving on to a long career in the restaurant industry and eventually politics. Calorophobia is the clinical term for an intense or irrational fear of clowns. The phobia is more common than most people expect and has been studied seriously by psychologists. Researchers suggest the fear often stems from the unsettling combination of an exaggerated human face and unpredictable behavior, a phenomenon sometimes linked to the broader concept of the uncanny valley. Portland, Oregon got its name from a coin flip. Two of its founders, Asa Lovejoy from Boston and Francis Pettygrove from Portland, Maine, each wanted to name the new settlement after their respective hometowns. Pettygrove won the toss in 1845, and the Oregon city took the name of the Maine original. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602, was the first formal stock market in history. It was created specifically to trade shares in the Dutch East India Company, the world's first publicly traded corporation. Investors could buy ownership stakes, receive dividends, and sell their shares to others. The core mechanics of that 17th century market, publicly listed companies, transferable shares, and a trading floor, remain the structural foundation of every stock exchange operating today. Botswana maintains strict laws prohibiting both the possession and distribution of pornographic material, with violations carrying potential fines or imprisonment. The Southern African nation has consistently upheld these regulations as part of broader public decency laws, and enforcement applies to both physical and digital formats of such content.
North Korea reportedly maintains a list of 28 state-approved hairstyles, 18 for women and 10 for men, from which citizens are expected to choose. The policy reflects the government's broader approach to controlling public appearance and expression. Western-influenced styles have historically been discouraged, and hair guidelines are reportedly enforced at schools and workplaces. Monetary policy and fiscal policy are the two primary tools governments use to manage economies. Monetary policy, controlled by central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve, adjusts interest rates and money supply. Fiscal policy, controlled by governments, adjusts taxation and spending. Used together or independently, they influence inflation, employment, and growth, though economists debate their effectiveness and appropriate timing with considerable disagreement. In Melbourne, Florida, wearing a thong bikini in public is actually prohibited by local ordinance. The law specifically targets overly revealing swimwear in public spaces outside of designated beach areas. Melbourne is a coastal city, but apparently there are still limits to what's considered acceptable beachwear on its streets. Switzerland's banking secrecy laws, formally codified in the Banking Act of 1934, legally prohibit Swiss bank employees from disclosing any client account information to third parties without explicit consent from the account holder. The laws made Switzerland a global destination for private banking for decades, though international pressure and tax evasion treaties have significantly eroded strict banking secrecy around 2009-2010. You've got enough material to keep people thinking for the rest of the day, and enough to impress someone at dinner tonight. If you want more where that came from, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.